Welcome everyone to the Police Oversight Board Case Review Committee. It's Tuesday, March the 26th, 2019. It's 11:31 a.m. Okay, now we have a discussion. We have case 13218.
Do we have any appeals?
No, I'm sorry. We have a review of appeals. We have no appeals. Okay, discussion 13218.
Yeah, this is where we're going to have the explanation of what the chief was concurring with and what he wasn't, to explain his letter to us so that we could understand it for this. That was the purpose of this being on here.
So ultimately, the chief ended up not concurring with the sustained in our finding after a pre-disciplinary hearing.
Okay, explain it, as if we never heard it before.
We sustained Officer S for failure to follow up and do a thorough and complete investigation based upon an incident reported to her while she was a volunteer at the school. That sustained went through the command review process. That officer appealed the finding and the
finding that the police department had?
The finding of the CPOA.
Oh, okay.
And the recommendation for a written reprimand. After the pre-disciplinary hearing conducted by the chief, he rescinded his concurrence with that finding and found it to be an unfounded.
And do you know why?
The explanation provided by the officer, he believed, met the obligation that the officer had under the SOP for reporting of the to the CACU and to CYFD.
So how does that jive with what you think? You think she had an obligation to follow up, and you're saying the chief disagrees?
Correct. And
Okay.
I think I think that the difference is there's the levels of how they report within the unit, and obligation to the distinction of being dispatched to a call. The officer was not dispatched to this call, so therefore it creates a different reporting standard at the SOP
And
at
is
that
that
time.
spelled out in SOPs?
Yes, and that's part of the distinctions for some of the findings of the internal affairs investigations as well.
So
There's
for
a
the other officers?
distinction between something being reported to you versus if you're the dispatched officer to that call. There's a different
Okay,
reporting standard.
The other officers where there was no fault found, they were all dispatched?
I can't say that for sure without going back and looking at all of the cases that we looked at. But that's the distinction for the finding with this particular finding.
So with all of the officers who were involved in this case, no one is at fault, according to the police department, is that correct?
At fault for which incident?
For case 132-18.
Well, if you're talking about the call out for the discarded clothing at the school, then that's correct. The only sustained finding for that incident was for Officer A not conducting himself professionally and making a disparaging comment about a supervisor at CYFD. That's the only sustained finding related to that particular incident
By the police department?
by the police department.
Okay. So, if you were to tell this story to the general public, what story would you tell? And from the CPOA standpoint, what happened here?
What happened is officers were dispatched for the particular incident that happened in November. Officers were dispatched based upon the call of a school teacher because a student did not appear at school that day, and she was concerned about that student not showing up for school. 24 hours prior, the child had come to school dirty with soiled clothes and soiled underwear. Those clothes were taken from the child. She was put into other clothing, and those particular dirty clothing were thrown away. Upon the calling of the police and CYFD, who both appeared on the scene that day, other officers were dispatched to what they believed to be the resident of the juvenile. Those officers went there, spoke with the child, another juvenile, determined that there was not reasonable suspicion of a crime being committed. Therefore, the abandoned clothing was left at the school and not taken for safekeeping.
And what was CYFD doing as they were on the same call?
CYFD was there doing the interviewing along with detectives from the CACU.
So CYFD concurred that there was no actionable thing for the police to do?
That's correct.
Okay, so then what happens?
Well, from our standpoint,
What about the real-time crime center part? Add that into this.
well, at that time, the Real-Time Crime Center and the officers do not have access to the portal for CYFD. So they cannot go back in and trace the information based upon subject name. So the only traceable aspect of the RTCC issue is addresses. And these folks are transient people. So it's not like they're at 123 Main Street every day where they have a residence and a consistent residence. They would go from hotel to hotel to hotel. We were able to track down incidents by the investigator casting a broad net for all of the hotels in that general area. And that's how we were able to track down other incidents. So from the standpoint of tracking through RTCC, there wasn't a consistent enough basis on which to give any other information, and officers at that time did not have access to the portal for CYFD.
And CYFD, who was also there, didn't either?
I can't speak for CYFD.
You don't know? Okay.
No.
So the information, the other question I have is when the child was being interviewed, was she interviewed in front of the parents or in front of anyone else?
No, she was not.
So she said everything's cool, and she's good, everything's fine, is that the?
There was no reporting that resulted from the interview by the detectives from the CACU.
I'm asking if the child was asked if she was okay, if she was asked separately, you said yes. Is there anything that came from that? You're saying that nothing came from that interview that caused either CYFD or APD to be concerned?
That's correct.
Okay. And your findings were in terms of the other officers that there was no wrongdoing on the part of the other officers?
That's correct. There were no other sustained findings for the incidents that we reviewed.
Okay. And the one that you did have is contested by the chief because their policy is different if you have a call out, if you're called out to that scene versus if you are just talked to by the teacher. That's
my understanding of the distinction.
Okay, so that may be something for the policy committee to take a look at and make a recommendation relative to whether or not, that to me is the only place left to go with this, is as far as a policy, is if the non-concurrence is based on a different standard for one way of getting there or another, then that maybe is something policy wants to take a look at.
A different standard for what?
A different standard for the obligation of the officer. For me, having been in human service all this time, for all these years, everybody's a mandatory reporter, I thought. And if somebody thinks that there's something amiss, it wouldn't matter to me how I found out. That I found out would be enough. And it sounds to me from what Director Harness is saying that the police department has a different standard if you are just passing information from the teacher to the police officer passes it to CYFD or CACU, but it's different if that same officer was called out to that, like the officers were later called out. The standard for each officer is different. For the officers who were called out, there's one standard of what there is expected of them in terms of follow-up. For the officer who first received the information from the teacher, it's a different standard. Am I hearing you right?
The incident in which we sustained, which the chief later non-concurred, was an incident where this was brought to the attention of the officer as a volunteer at the school, not as a dispatched officer. And while the officer did pass the information along to the CACU, the Crimes Against Children's Unit, that in itself, under the chief's interpretation, was enough of a passing along and a reporting for that incident. The standard is different if that officer had been dispatched to that call for the reporting standard for doing a complete preliminary investigation.
Okay, so do you see the differences that he's saying?
I don't know. I can't speak to that. I think if that's the situation, and you want the policy committee to take it on, then we'll need you to come and make a presentation about it.
No, that's fine. I am trying to understand the difference between those two things, and what is expected of CACU once they get a referral like that? What does the SOPs require of them?
Well, I mean, it would require a follow-up investigation, and we have to. I mean, we examined a lot of incidences, and in the particular case that we sustained and the chief did not concur, this was the standard that was set forth. This is the chief's interpretation. And when you look at what Internal Affairs sustained on for the preliminary investigation, it was a very fine line between these officers who went out and investigated, and it was their judgment as to whether or not it was neglect or whether it was simply a matter of poverty. And in the officer's judgment, where they were sustained, they determined that it was simply poverty and not neglect. And Internal Affairs found that in those instances, they should have completed and done a preliminary investigation.
And the chief concurs with that?
And the chief concurred with those, yes.
Okay.
So what is the status of, you know, the board asked if we could just look at the file in order to understand the concurrence and non-concurrence letter. That's just the contextual information I need to understand what each of those things says. And at the last board meeting, you said that a response was being prepared. What is the status? Where are we at on that?
I don't have the response yet.
Okay. Can you follow up with him? Because at this point, it's been well over a month since we have made the request.
I can, but this doesn't fall under any mandatory reporting ordinance situation, so I can follow
He's
up.
not required to reply to you? Is that what you're saying?
There's no time frame set forth.
But
Well,
it's
probably the timeline, regardless of whether there's policy and required timelines, the timeline starts when he gets the assessment, right?
When he gets a request?
When he gets the request, that's when we can say we're expecting a reply, right?
Certainly you can express a timeline that you would prefer.
Yeah, well,
For
I
him
mean,
to
we've
respond.
studied this case a lot, and it seems to me that asking to understand his position versus ours instead of this letter, which is not helpful at all. This thing that says we concur, we don't concur, it doesn't give us enough information.
Okay.
So somebody needs to get us more information so we understand it. This is too important an issue to leave alone. I have another question. My question is, now that do you know if the portal access is now live?
That I do not know.
I think that should be a part of your report to us in April to see if it is live, because we would like to prevent this happening again in terms of information. And my second question is, do you think that there is anything else that needs repair in order for this situation to not repeat itself? What else needs to occur?
I mean, I haven't really done that examination to give you an answer today.
Okay, so as far as this is to me, and I've said this before, this is a major boulder in the path of building better relationships with the police department and the community. How we treat our children and how we follow up from those things should be something we all agree on, and we don't. So my question is, what needs to happen? And it may not be a staff function, but it may be a board function to make a request. But I'd like to get a clear assessment of what you think the problems are. How do we prevent this kind of round robin, it feels like? Is the RTCC enough? Is the portal enough? Does it need to be something else? Where else are there weaknesses in this system that we should be paying attention to from a policy standpoint or a recommendation standpoint for the board to make to the city? I would like your staff's assessment of that because I'm guessing that fixing the real-time crime center and fixing the portal is a good step, but I'm worried it's not enough. So I'd like your opinion as a staff about what else could happen that would make it better. We may not end at perfection, but we need to get a lot closer if we're going to improve the relationship between the police department and the community. So your assessment really matters to me, and I'd love to have it. And you may think that whatever it is this is what the staff can do, this is what the board can do, this is whatever you think. I would like your analysis of it.
So yeah, I think if you could just follow up with him, that would be great, because this is definitely like something that the work product was completed months ago. So a yes or no as to why we can or can't have it, or giving it to us and telling us, or versus telling us we can't have it for particular legal reasons. It seems like that shouldn't take, 6 weeks or whatever. I would expect APD to be able to respond regarding whether or not we're going to get this information contextualized via the investigation or whatever it may be by now. So I would just ask you to follow up on that. And I think you did say that you would do that at our last full board meeting. And then the other reason why this was on the agenda was because we were wanting a status update on where the, completion, this investigation has been sent back to you guys to further investigate particular things. And we are expecting a status update in regards to that at this meeting also.
But I thought we did the real-time crime center thing. That was one of them. What was the other one?
Well, I mean, we would need, this investigation is just like any other, so I'm expecting to have back a findings letter that actually analyzes and
I think we did
lists
that.
this.
That already exists, doesn't it?
Yeah, but we sent it back.
Okay,
And
I'm
then-
just asking what are the clarification points you want. One was the real-time crime center, and there was one more.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so
I think we got an answer to the real-time crime center.
well, okay, so if the investigation is done then where is the findings letter, the new findings letter? That way we can take a look at that and then move on. That's what's required to finish the case. I mean, the complainant still hasn't had this case, the board hasn't closed this case. We sent it back. Now we're expecting it to come back before us in the same way as these come before us with that stuff finished up. I mean, it's all good and well that we've talked about some of these things, but we still need to have it in writing.
You're saying
We need to
that,
send
for
it to the
example, the
complainant.
real-time crime center answer needs to be in the letter.
Right.
Okay,
As well
I
as
got it. All right, that's cool. That's fine. I think the thing I was talking about is bigger than that. It's bigger than the findings in this letter. And I can't remember myself what the second thing was.
Well, I mean, the thing that constantly comes up is whether or not the decision to throw the underwear away versus not collect them was proper. And I've consistently requested that be analyzed against the SOP for evidence collection. It has not yet been done so. I don't know if APD did it, again, because I haven't seen their work. But we never did do it, and we keep hearing that it's either because of reasonable suspicion or probable cause or legal standards that I would argue are, that I know are not applicable to the evidence question, and we need to see that laid out. And then there were a few other things that have been spelled out in detail. I mean, they exist in writing. We've had several
You mean
meetings.
Mr. Larson's letter?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, because we also talked about it when the case first came to us, and we asked for the CPOA to do further analysis. There were things in his complaint, questions he raised that weren't addressed, and so we were asking to see an analysis
Well, and some of them we've
those.
talked about, but you're saying they aren't in the last letter.
Yeah, we don't have a last letter. We
Exactly.
need a final product.
Okay.
And I'm wondering where the final product is at, or when we'll get the final product.
We will make every attempt to get that findings letter to you by the next CMC.
Okay, great. And do you feel fairly confident, somewhat confident, not confident at all that we'll have it by then?
He just said that they would do it.
I know, I mean,
I
he
said
said.
I would make every attempt to do it, so.
And I believe what you're saying is true. And I'm also just wondering if you anticipate being able to get that done or not.
I guess, but at this point, we have other cases that are on timelines, and this one is beyond the timeline, and we will make every attempt to adjust the findings letter to address the concerns raised, and have it to you by the 23rd of April of 2019.
April 23rd.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I still would like to get your opinion in whatever that is about how to fix this moving forward as systemically. And if you can do that, or if you can point me in the direction of where I can go to get more information about that, if it's a burden on your staff, I just want to know. I really think this is why we're here. is to enhance the relationship between the community. And if we don't do that in cases of child abuse, we are not going to accomplish our mission. And so all of us can't be just writing off a checklist. And that's what the chief gave us, was a checklist. And I understand the ordinance to say that the chief will respond in context. He will give us an explanation for why he disagrees with us. I don't think that's optional. So if they don't agree with us, I appreciate getting your feedback on that, but that's not what I got from him. The letter we got from him is not that. It's not what the ordinance says he'd give us. So some of this he can do, you know.
Okay, I would like to also add something. In regards to sending us that final letter, can we receive it prior to the meeting? I'd like to
So we can read it. Yeah.
So I can read
It's
it.
coming for the CRC.
Yeah, for the-
Yeah.
So we'll get it.
We'll upload it in the timelines as we do with all the
And
CRC
what's
cases.
what's it like, the timelines? It's usually what,
It's just like Thursday or Friday before.
Well, we try to give you at least a week.
yeah, because I was just saying I'd like to review it against some of the information I have to see if some of the questions have been answered. Okay, I look forward to reading it. Thank you.